What is up, guys? Today on the Football Guys Dynasty Football Show, we're diving into a listener mailbag. That's how you know it's December, because we're looking for topics that help us get through this dark time and just kind of get into the rookie prospects, which we're going to be doing here on the channel. But I think it's fun. We open it up to a bunch of different listeners on X and into our DMs and all over the place, and we got a bunch of fun questions. So let's get started. Is Kyren Williams a top 10 dynasty running back? My short answer is I don't know. I'm just kidding. Jeff, you're the smart one on the show. Where do you have Kyren Williams in your top 10 dynasty running backs? Can we look at in the future and think that he can kind of solidify himself there?
So I currently have Kyren Williams entirely too low, to be honest with you. Let's see here. 1, 2.
I'm glad we had this really dialed in to the start of this show where Jeff knew we had this on the show sheet. And hey,
like running back 12-ish, I think is where I land on Kyren Williams. I think there's running backs that are in, I like their offensive structure a little bit better, or might have higher draft capital. I think have higher ceilings talent-wise than what I think Kyren Williams presents with. Production-wise, you can't dismiss it. And I've talked the last couple of weeks about when you look at yards per game, Kyren Williams is right on line with Christian McCaffrey, and really a massive gap between other running backs. And so that's great to see. But I think that when you really dial in on we haven't seen, it seems like he disappears from the passing game, which I think is a big key of what you want in a dynasty running back. I think there is just better, I hesitate to say more talented options, but better, more talented options, I think, than Kyren Williams.
I have an RB10 in my latest rankings update, and I have him ahead of Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, David Montgomery, Ken Walker. There are guys that I do prefer Kyren over that you probably won't see in a ton of rankings, and that's simply because we talk about what do we look for in a running back, and it's usage and projecting that usage forward. And I know that Kyren doesn't have the draft capital that suggests that he's a long-term answer for them, but he does have the production, and I think he has Sean McVay's trust, and I think that's the number one thing in a running back. He fumbled the ball twice last week, and he didn't get put on the bench. He actually went out there and got more touches, and so I think that's it. Had he been benched because of those two fumbles, I think maybe we're discussing this a little bit differently. But Sean McVay says, go out there, fix your mistakes and things like that. I think he's locked in as a top 10 back, because I think RB10, if you look at, even if they bring in competition, I think Kyren's going to be the lead back next year. And ultimately, I think they want this to be a one-headed attack. That they've shown that that's probably where they're successful in deploying their running backs. And so I think they want Kyren to be that. So I'm in top 10, barely, but top 10.
Yeah, he's top 12 for me. I think the question is, he's basically 90% of the snaps the last few weeks, and is that sustainable moving forward? Like, the way I look at dynasty running backs is what they can do for me in the next game, because it's so volatile that I'm like, hey, is he going to be there? Is the injury? What does that look like? I think will he have sustained value? I think his value is not sustained like some of these other top 5 guys, right? Like, I know Christian hates ETN, but like ETN, Taylor, CMC, Brees, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, like those guys all have that value built. And even like Javonte Williams, who hasn't played very well, and you're like, hey, yeah, he probably has a little bit more value than Kyren Williams in Dynasty, which probably could be wrong, but it's just that perception of that next game theory. Like, and I think that's how I'm starting to look at running backs, where, yeah, he might be top 10 right now, but, heading into the offseason, where is he going to be? I don't know. I don't think it really matters then. I think then it's a perception deal, and you just have to kind of move him if you want. I know Jeff has moved him a lot this offseason or in this season, and I think that's where you have to be with Kyren. I don't think he's one of those assets you can just hold on to. I think he's one of those guys that you look for the right deal, then you move him, because I don't think he falls in that top 5 where I'm comfortable having on my roster.
So the Rams have selected a running back every single year that Sean McVay's been there in the draft. And so my hesitation on Kyren Williams is it does seem like there is just a general consensus not want to give him the credit that he likely deserves given production. If they go out and draft a guy that people get excited about in day 2, day 3-ish, then what happens to Kyren Williams' value? And I think that is my hesitation leading into the offseason to rank him too high in Dynasty. But I think that, if you we make the jokes like last year about the Dameon Pierce jokes where he made it through the minefield and everybody was ready to go. And I remember, it might have been you, Kevin, but I remember somebody every single week when something would happen that the Texans wouldn't add talent, they'd have a Mario meme of like Mario dodging bullets for Dameon Pierce. And I just feel like that Kyren Williams, we're going to step into that a little bit with Kyren Williams this offseason.
It's a Spider-Man meme. And it's a GIF, Jeff, you boomer. But yeah, it was a Spider-Man. And yeah, I mean, it was. But I was also advocating selling Dameon Pierce, too. I will say this. They have one thing going for them. They haven't drafted a good running back besides Kyren Williams. So that's part of it also. Like, shout out, pour one out for Zach Evans. Can't get on the field. It's killing us out there. Any last takes here, Christian, on Kyren before we move on to the next question?
No, I just, I guess I'm not as sell now as you guys on Kyren, and maybe I would have been a year ago. In the same circumstances, I probably would have been a year ago, but I think we've got such proven production, and like I said, I think the Rams do want to deploy just a singular back, and I think he's shown that he can handle that, and I think that's the one thing. You're right. They haven't drafted any good running backs, and to be quite honest with you, this running back class is fine, but it's not one that we're looking for, like, oh, Zach Evans is on the Rams, even though we were just wrong about that. But like, there aren't those types of guys, even on day 3, I don't think, that really will make me hesitate on Kyren. So I might hold personally.
Yeah. I mean, if you do the... Oh, go ahead.
Kyren Williams or Rachaad White?
Kyren Williams.
Yeah, probably Kyren Williams.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah. I think it's close, though. But again, it's neither for me. But if you're new to the show or the podcast, you should know this. Christian loves running backs. I like them. Jeff hates them. So that is just a distinction between us three. So when we talking about running backs, that's just kind of just give you a little background. If you're new, if you've listened to the show long enough, that's just generally how we look at those guys. But before we move on, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Comment below with any questions, trades, or thoughts on any topic that we cover here. Now we're going to be diving into one of my favorite questions we got asked, and because it talks about theory, and I love dynasty theories. And here's the question. Would love to know each of your opinions on going all in for a championship versus staying the course with a dynasty team. For example, a team you constructed as a young team rather than a win now, but they've exceeded expectations, are in the second round of the playoffs. Do you start selling picks and young pieces to go for a ship, or stay the course and keep building as you have been? This is the ultimate question now, and I love this type of question because, do you win now for the money, or do you keep building that roster and hoping you build in a dynasty where you can make mistakes if you're selling off assets? All right, Jeff, I know you like money, so where are you leaning here? What is your thoughts on this question?
Well, my thought is that if you are in the if you've constructed a young team and now it is in the second round of the playoffs, then your young pieces are producing for you. So why are you going to sell those young pieces that are producing for you and winning games for older players? And I think that way, way too often do people think that there's a massive difference between players like, I don't know, for example, Cooper Kupp versus God, I wish I had Jalen Waddle or something like that. Like, I feel like people in their mind think that I've seen it. He's an elite guy, whereas this other guy, like, he just hasn't as proven. So I'm going to make that move and I'm going to go win a championship. But we see, especially coming off this week, how much randomness was involved in this week in the production. I mean, people wrote James Cook off coming into this year, had a massive game. You look at Devin Singletary, was a complete afterthought, had a huge game. There is so much randomness involved in fantasy that as long as you're able to put out a good lineup that you feel good about, 10 good starters that you feel good about, I don't think there is pushing all in. Like, it is just, can I put my best lineup out? Now, if you have a massive hole, if somebody is hurt and you lost huge production out of a player and you're going to start Kendre Miller or something this week, then yes, go out there and target guys like a James Conner or something like that. But when I'm thinking to go all in, I'm thinking of like probably older running backs that are in good opportunities that I feel good, have a good chance to put up some production. And I'm going to give you a 3rd round pick for that because I don't think anybody else in the league is going to give you a 3rd round pick for that old running back. And if you want to move off so bad, then you're going to take my 3rd round pick and I'm going to get that guy. But that's my view of all-in moves. Now, I did win a championship last year because I made an all-in move, and what that all-in move ended up being was 3 later to mid first, and I got back AJ Brown and Travis Kelce, and that was able to push me in to go all in. But like, those are the types of things that if I'm going to make it all in move, it is going to be a foundational thing that is going to help me for the next 5 to 6 years. Like that's where it is of, and one of the things that Nick Scripp, Kevin's friend and our friend, he made a kind of an all-in trade with me, and it was an interesting one because he lost Tank Dell to injury, and he had a win now team. He traded me Tank Dell in a 2nd-round pick, and he got Zay Flowers. So he put some production into his lineup, but he stayed within the same time frame, and I really like that thinking. And so those are the types of all-in moves that I would look to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that last part, because I think that's the key, right? Is you don't want to kind of limit yourself. The notion of going all in could mean really hampering your upside for the next 2 to 3 years. If you're going after those old running backs and things like that. If I'm going all in, I'm trying to get a piece that I am going to build around moving forward, but will also help me down the stretch. But you mentioned, if you have a hole, I think I had a good example this year where I lost Mark Andrews when his injury happened. And so I had to pay whatever to get a starting tight end. However, I had Tucker Kraft on my bench, and so I really didn't have to do that. Tucker Kraft was my highest scoring tight end this last week when I lost in the first round of my Dynasty playoffs. And so, and I didn't start him because I went to get Cole Kmet, who was like not an all-in move, but a move that I needed to make if I wanted to win a championship. So I think that's it. You kind of trying to patchwork your holes. You try not to give up everything that you have, because I think Dynasty is one thing where you should always be win now. You should, if you need to tear it all the way down, you need to then make every move from that point forward as a win now move, because why else are you playing Dynasty? I don't believe in 2 to 3 year rebuilds. I believe in constructing young teams, but I believe in if I've gotten a slew of bad young players, I believe in kind of capitalizing on that value as well. So I do think if you're in the 2nd round of the playoffs, you already are win now. You don't need to mortgage your future to go get that, especially when you're projecting that those guys are going to be even better next year. I think you're just adding pieces to that to kind of supplement it.
Yeah, I would argue that if you make the playoffs, you're in win now. As soon as you make the playoffs and you're one of the best 6 or whatever you're in your thing, go get it. Like, go look at attack that matchup, what you have there. And I think to your point, I wanted to push back a little that I don't think you have to give up first or really capital anymore. You can do damage with 2nd and 3rd round picks now because everybody hates old guys. You can get some of these old players right now. Like Mike Evans went for 2 seconds in a league. Like, if you could get Mike Evans and you're looking at a Cooper Kupp 2-year window, go get Mike Evans right now. He's fine. He's going to be on your roster anyway, and you're be excited about that too. So, like, I think that there's a way to keep your first. And then what you should do is be consolidating some of your roster cloggers right now. Be the first one to get rid of like a Bateman for a 3rd if you don't believe in Bateman or whatever you want to do. Go out there and look at those roster cloggers. Start then you can churn some of those 3rds to get them back. So you can still kind of do that. And that's when you go target the guys that build through youth only. And Bateman's coming back. Okay, I'll just take some picks. I don't necessarily need Bateman. He's my wide receiver 8. You think he can kind of pump up there? That's fine. Just give me a couple 3rds, a 4th, whatever you think that you is value for Bateman. I gave him up for a 3rd recently because I didn't need him anymore, and I just consolidated. I picked up some other guys. I think there's a way to build that way and always kind of perpetually build. And I don't think you have to tear it down anymore. I think that's the wrong move now. I think that there's always going to be a way to retool, rebuild. I had a question in my DMs the other day. They asked, should I give up CMC straight up for Nicholas Singleton? Now, if you don't know who that is Penn State running back. I said, no way. Do not do that. CMC is otherworldly for 2 years. Go get an elite asset back for CMC, wide receiver, whatever you want to do there. Don't give up just for picks. And don't just kind of tear down anymore. I think that's the wrong way to play.
Yeah, I think the pick value, it has swung so far to the extreme. I think a couple years ago, you were able to be in a position where when I first started playing Dynasty, it baffled me because you could have a veteran like a Mike Evans, and you could flip Mike Evans for a good young receiver and a first-round pick. And that was the way that values were in Dynasty, where like, well, he's an elite older guy, and I don't want to wait for this rookie to produce, and so I'll give you my first to do it. Now people guard those first-round picks like gold, which probably is more of the correct way to do it. But at the same time, how many of those picks miss? I mean, you look back 2 years ago, 3 years ago on the rookie draft, I mean, 40% miss. I mean, 30%, you know, there are so many players that were consensus sure things as first round picks that are absolutely nothing now, just 2 or 3 years down the line. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty there, but at the same time, Jamar Chase goes 6th in his rookie class or 5th in his rookie class, and now he's a dynasty wide receiver 2, and you just can't replace that value that he can add onto those rosters, and you can only get those via first round picks.
Jeff Bell, we just have to push people to the rookie guide so that they aren't missing on their first round picks. And so that'll happen eventually. Shameless plug. A little shameful, but it's okay.
So yeah, I do think that I do want to. This next question kind of goes with this. So that's kind of that win now piece. This question was a good one. Do you think that this year's rash of injuries at quarterback has changed the way we should think about the position in Superflex? For example, is having 3 NFL starting quarterbacks roster necessary now, or is it need to fill a roster with high-end backup quarterbacks? I'm excited for this question because me and Jeff are complete opposites here. I know that we are the way we build our teams. So Jeff, what do you think here?
Well, I mean, I like to have 2 elite options at quarterback. That's my first and primary goal. I've always been a long believer of wanting to have a 3rd starting quarterback and valuing that. But I think that I'm coming off of it a little bit, and I think it's got less to do with what we've seen from this year and more roster construct. I mean, some of it's what we have seen this year, but you know, when you look at like Gardner Minshew wasn't in on many waivers, or like Tyler Huntley's not on a lot of waivers. Like some of these players that are backups that, you know, Jameis Winston's not on a lot of waivers in deeper leagues. So some of these higher end backups that you feel good about are already rostered. It's just so much randomness on like who might be a productive, like who had Jake Browning as being productive, whereas, or Joe Flacco coming in and he's been like fantasy quarterback 6 over the last 3 weeks. I mean, it's just, but I hesitate to fundamentally push all the way in that direction based off just one season. Now, if you know, Kirk Cousins was never hurt prior to this year, and I know Joe Burrow was hurt his rookie year, but he's been healthy after that. And so there's a lot of freak things that are happening, I think, at the quarterback position this year. And so I'm very hesitant to completely change my mindset. And more of it is how many of those 3rd quarterbacks really do have value, I think is where my mindset is shifting on holding a guy like a Kenny Pickett, or like some of these guys like Ryan Tannehill coming into this year feeling like, oh, I've got Ryan Tannehill, I've got a 3rd quarterback, he's done already. And so I think that's where my thought is of I'm not going to pay a premium for just to have a 3rd starting quarterback that I don't feel good starting anyways.
And I think that's a fantastic point, is when you look at a dynasty startup where those 3rd quarterbacks are going, you can still get kind of premium like wide receiver 3s in there. And when you look at what some of these backups are producing on a points per game basis, you could potentially, if you just, instead of taking a quarterback and a filler running back in those mid rounds, and you take 2 wide receivers that you might be able to plug into your lineup, one of the best teams that I have seen across all of my leagues is constructed with all of these backup quarterbacks. And I think they had, Anthony Richardson at one point or whatever. But they are just loaded at every other position, including they've been super flexing some skill position players. And I think that that's a viable way to win. I kind of mentioned that as a strategy last year where Baker Mayfield's getting you 16 points a game right now. If you can go out and get someone that's getting you close to that, I think it's worth having that roster spot, because that player might hold more value in the future, especially with where you have to draft them. I do want to mention, though, the filling the roster with high-end backup quarterbacks. I don't think that's a viable thing to do from the jump. I think it's basically going to be you look at opportunity and maybe add a few. I think I've had a few rosters this year with Marcus Mariota in case Jalen Hurts went down, which is gross to say out loud, but it's one of those things where you look at the high opportunity players and good offenses, you add those guys. So I think Jake Browning could have been a fine stash before the season. We just, didn't project Burrow to miss a lot of time. But I think that that's a viable strategy instead of having those roster cloggers like Kevin mentioned in that other question. I think that you can do that. It's just you have to be strategic with it because you don't want to be stuck holding, I don't know, who's a terrible backup quarterback?
Malik Willis.
Kyle Trask. Like not a player I really want on my roster, but I'd rather roster Marcus Mariota, I think. So it's a very interesting question, and I like the strategy questions here.
Well, let's be clear. It takes a little luck too. I was able to start Nick Mullins this week. I was just lucky. I actually didn't even realize I had picked him up 4 weeks ago. I was like, oh crap, I got Nick Mullins on this roster. I'm going to plug him in. I think it does take a little luck too. I think, I did some research. I actually researched for the show this week. And I went through one of my Dynasty mocks one of my Dynasty actual leagues. I don't want Jeff to yell at me. So I went through a league that we did, a startup. And here are the QB3 that people picked in that 9 to 12 range. Ritter went off the board in round 10. And you got guys like the Jacoby Myers. Look what he's been able to do. James Cook went at 10-3 this one. Ritter went at 10-2. So imagine if you would have had James Cook on your roster. Now it's a whole different ballgame there. Jimmy G went in the 11th round. Sam Howell, who was good, don't get me wrong, but now you're looking like, okay, is he going to be a viable option after this? Tannehill went in that round as well. So when you're looking at those guys that you really were pushing here, even Hendon Hooker went in the 14th round of this draft. What? You just wasted a ton, a spot for a lot of talent around there. So I do I'm surprised Jeff has changed his tune. So I'm more of give me those.
I'm getting ready to push back here. So
I'm one of those guys that's giving me 2 elite quarterbacks. I'm in Jeff's boat. If I can get 2 top 12 guys in the startup, I'll do that. At least I have those 2 guys. And then I will, because I do think it gives you a higher floor, right? So I got Dak and Joe Burrow in the league this year, and I lost Burrow, but then I was able to plug other guys in that spot. I traded a third for Minshew, right? I do think there's something to that too. I think like we just talked about with draft capital now, you can get a Baker Mayfield for a third at the beginning of the year, second in the middle of the year, and you're looking at a high-end quarterback in Superflex this year on a contending roster. I think that's doable every year. I don't think you necessarily need to waste a roster spot on a middle-tier quarterback. But go ahead, Jeff. Push back.
So I think we're having 2 different conversations here because when you look at the acquisition cost on a player like Geno Smith or the way Brock Purdy was a year or more ago, some of these guys, I think that you do need to be very aggressive on adding potential players that can be quarterbacks, because I think one of the biggest weaknesses in fantasy football and Dynasty Hive Mind is people are far too definitive in what they think is going to play out. And so one of the things that I wrote a big article today, and it was just kind of fried my brain to write it. But one of the things that I was kind of thinking about when I was looking at numbers was Jared Goff's dynasty value 2 years ago when he was traded from the Rams to the Lions. Jared Goff was a 26-year-old quarterback who had gone first in the draft, had been very, very productive for fantasy, very productive for NFL purposes, and was completely written off in Dynasty. And he was just a complete afterthought after that trade from to the Lions. And then Geno Smith was a joke of a pickup in the offseason. And Baker Mayfield this past year was a completely written off, and Brock Purdy a year ago was just funny. The value that you could get. I had one league that I traded Sam Darnold last year for a depleted C2C second round pick last year, and then I turned around and flipped that pick for Brock Purdy in a league that we are all in. And so I do think that you need to be aggressive. Now I agree with you on startup value in terms of where looking at some of these quarterbacks, a guy like the way Desmond Ritter was valued. I think that that's an example of where it's fine in my 3rd round of my rookie draft in Superflex if he's sitting there to make that kind of a bet, and then you turn around and you flip them. But you need to embrace that window and flip them if you really don't believe in them. But that said, I think that it's people are entirely too definitive on the way they think something's going to play out.
I tend to agree, but I think the inverse of that was a lot of people were doing that for Trey Lance, and it cost a lot of dynasty teams. I was one of them. I think all three of us did at some point with Trey Lance, just taking those shots because we saw an opportunity. And I just think, that's we've certainly lost some value there. But I also think that you can't approach dynasty with weariness or being afraid to lose value. You sometimes just have to go. And I think I made a bold trade for Geno Smith last year, and it's really helped me. He's been my QE3 this entire season. Now, have I been able to plug other guys into that superflex spot when I needed to? Yeah, and that's kind of my other point that we talked about earlier. So it's an interesting discussion, and certainly not something that's going away. So I'm sure we'll talk about it in the offseason too.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's exciting. But on that same note, too, with this question, contending teams that had to open up the checkbook to pick up some extra quarterbacks this season, he asked, what the heck do we do with all these dudes? We got all these old dudes on my roster. We got Stafford. We got Mayfield. Maybe some of you guys traded for Dobbs. You got all these older guys on the roster there. What do we do with them? And he says, I have a superflex team with Watson, Cousins on IR, and then 4 quarterbacks past 32 years old. I think for me personally, just looking at this, well, you hold. Like, you're going to hold no matter what. You're just waiting until they accumulate value. But I don't think you have to look at 32 as being a number that breaks quarterbacks anymore. Like, I think Rodgers is going to be a viable starter next year if he comes back from that Achilles. Like, you're like, oh, hey, he's still going to have value. I guarantee you Aaron Rodgers would probably go for a first at some point next year. Like, it's just one of those things where people are going to buy in. Don't give me that look, Jeff. If he comes back and he's doing the Acacia or whatever the hell the drug is, like, everybody's going to get excited again. Like, hey, we're buying in, QB1, those type of things. Like, I think that if you're holding that many quarterbacks, it actually puts you in a position of power in your league, because I do think that you're going to be able to move them. Now, will you be able to move them for viable assets, all like valuable, like first all time? No, but it does give you flexibility to kind of get some guys, plug some holes if you need to. And then you could be in this position next year where you need to use them too. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sell them either. Like, I don't mind that spot. I don't mind having those quarterbacks. What about you, Jeff?
We have goldfish brains, and I think that what you're going to see probably next year is, while the talk this year is about these backup quarterbacks that have been effective and given fantasy points, you're going to turn around to next year and somebody's going to lose their starting quarterback, and they're going to be banging down the door for Kirk Cousins because they need an option that they can plug in. Because I do think I am very leery that we are seeing a foundational shift in the way that people are just fine rolling any backup quarterback when you get a guy that you deem to be a starter that goes out for the rest of the year. And so, you're holding, you're not worried about it at all right now. And as you move in through the season, you're going to hold them through the offseason beauty pageant. Once we get into next August, when people are really starting to set their lineups and they're seeing the hole they have in their lineup, that's when you're going to sell and you're going to move off on the guys that you don't believe in, and you're going to recoup some of the investment that you made.
I'd also suggest gauging value around rookie draft time, because people get really excited for rookies, but there's also an opportunity where someone thinks, man, do I really need to add this rookie, or am I at this point in my, build status where I need to add a guy like Kirk Cousins, who I think can take me to the next level? You might be able to get more value at rookie draft time than you will be at any time in the offseason, at least. I think Jeff's right that if you hold all the way through the offseason beauty pageant, as he so eloquently put it, then I think you're going to maximize that value. But sometimes you hold too long. And so I think rookie draft time can be an opportunity to get out if you don't believe in them. But like Kevin said, 32 years old is not a great cutoff, especially when we look at how rough quarterback play has been across the board, especially from the young quarterbacks in the NFL. There is a problem in the NFL with young quarterbacks and how they've played. And so I think a lot of these guys are going to have extended careers because of that, because they're better options. So I don't know. I would say having 6 quarterbacks on a roster is too much for me. That's too many quarterbacks to roster, but your build status isn't done right now. You're still constructing that team. So
one other important note is we're going to see some movement between teams on some of these veteran quarterbacks, and especially that day that a guy moves, there's a bubble window there where you can move off. And somebody's going to land with Atlanta, and people are going to talk themselves into somebody landing with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson, that'll be a window to capitalize on some value on whoever does that. And there's some other places around that I think you're going to see some spinning of some quarterback spots. And Minnesota, if Cousins moves off Minnesota, whoever lands in Minnesota is going to have a value window given the attachment to Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, and those guys there.
Yeah, I mean, I just read a recent report, and this is an aside a little bit with Cousins. So they're still talking about him getting $35 million a year for 2 years. Like, teams are willing to go give him that. And if that's the case, Cousins is smashing by right now. Like, if you're able to kind of get Cousins right now some way, get him thrown in, there's some deals going out there. I wrote about him in my Football Guys big board about free agency. If you go in there, I put a bunch of trades in there. You can kind of go take a look. Like, it has all kinds of different trades that you can maybe stash Cousins in. Cousins, to me, is the perfect 2-year bridge guy. I'm going to take him. And if he stays on the Vikings with Hawkinson and Jefferson and Addison, those guys, like, you're excited about that in that area there.
Yep. And the full version of every show can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to continue with the mailbag over on the podcast version. So make sure you head over there, search up Football Guys Dynasty Football Show, and listen to the rest of our mailbag questions.